Thank you very much, and thank you, Nigel, for the opportunity and the invite to talk here today. I'm Welsh and can also talk quickly, so you're being tested this morning if nothing else. As Steve and Kate have alluded to, sport or any performance setting comes with psychological stress, and it's our ability to perform and deal with that psychological stress that's crucial and very important in order for us to achieve success. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is some research that myself and colleagues have been involved in, looking at how we've helped athletes and how we've helped teams in that regard. So I think in terms of trying to fit this talk within what we've heard already, I guess that the focus of this talk is really going to be about situational anxiety that Steve mentioned. It is about our response to a stressor. It is about our response to an imminent competition. It's about our response to a thought about an imminent competition. It's about being told that you're going to play in a particular position that you've never played before. And it's about understanding that particular response. And we know that there's a large swathe of research, we think back to Cannon's flight and fight response, that our response to stresses are different, differ across people, and Steve and Kate are both right, there's individual, but you have these physiological, behavioural and psychological responses that are different. And I'd like to talk about our work really builds on some work that Jim Blaskovich and colleagues have done, which they've looked at challenge and threat responses in individuals. And they drew really on sort of Dean Spear's work around physiological toughness, the idea that actually people who perform quite well under pressure can still have these strong physiological responses. And Dean Spear spoke about, or drew on a large body of research that showed that individuals who perform quite well under stress actually displayed high levels of epinephrine. So that actually strong physiological responses are not necessarily detrimental to performance. And based on Dean Spear's work and based on the underlying changes in the HPA axis that Steve spoke about, they were particularly interested in cardiovascular responses to stress, and in particular the change you see from baseline when someone is stressed. And there are two variables that they're interested in, cardiac output and vascular resistance. And what Blaskovich and colleagues proposed was that when we're relaxed, we're in a baseline state, and then we're placed under psychological stress, in a challenge state, what we see is an increase in cardiac output and a decrease in vascular resistance. So more blood pumped to the heart over a minute, decrease in vascular resistance, the blood can get to the muscles more quickly. It's an approach response to stress, whereas the threat response is an avoidance response. It's I'm not sure what's happening here. And in a threat response, what we see, and these are changes from baseline, so we place someone under stress, little or no changes in cardiac output, and an increase in vascular resistance. And it is these cardiovascular responses that give us an indication about whether someone is happy to approach the stressor, they're challenged by it, or whether they are threatened by it, and it's more of an avoidance response. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our research. I think it's important to say that actually when you talk about some of the research, a lot of this is group research, it's sort of averages, it's sanitized in the sense that it covers up a range of individual differences in responses there. And I'll talk a little bit about how we apply that in sports settings as well. So we sort of built on that, and we're particularly interested in what are the psychological factors that might underpin these challenge and threat responses. We focused in on three based on the literature. The first, not surprisingly, is self-efficacy. The higher levels of confidence you have, that's associated with a challenge response. Perceived control is important, okay? And the higher levels of perceived control you have, that's associated with a challenge response. And then also associated with a challenge response is a focus on what can be achieved, this approach focus. Whereas an avoidance focus, the fear on what might go wrong, is associated with a threat response. Now we're able to collect this data in our laboratory or when we go out into sporting settings. We could do it a number of ways. We can use an impedance cardiogram that's a bit more fiddly and has these band electrodes, or we can use a phonometer, and we use that just a finger cuff will give us the data, will give us the information we need, and it's a lot easier to use. So the typical protocol that we use is that we get people relaxed and we take baseline measures of cardiac output and vascular resistance, and then we stress them. Okay? We say something like, well, I'd like you to imagine, if we're working with some of the academy footballers at Stoke City, we'd say, I'd like you to imagine making your debut for the first team. or we'd like you to think about the game this afternoon. Or we'll say you're about to take part in this particular competition, which you're going to compare to your teammates, that you know they're about to do something that's quite practical. It's a stressor. And then what we're interested in is the reactivity, the change from baseline in the few minutes after, as they process the stressor and as they think about the upcoming competition or task or whatever it is they're about to do. So we have some research that sort of underpins, we've explored this in a number of different settings. So the typical protocol is that we'll bring people into a laboratory setting, and then we will get them nice and relaxed, and then we'll stress them. So the first task would be something commonly used, a Stroop Test. So we'll bring individuals in, they'll practice on the Stroop Test, and then we'll say, actually, this is the task that really matters. Your scores are going to be publicly displayed. You're going to be compared to other individuals. And then we look at their responses. And what we found is that those individuals who display the cardiovascular responses indicative of challenge, increase cardiac output, decrease vascular resistance, perform better. We then apply that to sport, so we take 21 netballers from university and local teams, and again we give them a shooting task. So they'll come in over a couple of days and they'll practice this shooting task, so we'll get baseline measures of how they perform. We then bring them in and we say, actually, okay, this is the one that we're really interested in. Just sit quietly, we'll collect some baseline measures, and then we'll tell you what you're about to do. So they get relaxed, and then we say, actually, right, okay, you're going to do the shooting task now. Again, publicly displayed. This evaluative threat's a common way of inducing stress in individuals. It's going to be recorded, and an England netball coach is going to look at your shooting, publicly displayed, competition, etc. And again, what we see is those individuals who display the challenge response when they think about the task perform better. And we can even see this at an elite level. So we collected data from 30 international cricketers, under 19, as well as sort of 12 county players. And they did a batting test. And this is something that's been developed by the ECB. You have to score 36 runs in 30 balls. It's done indoors using a bowling machine set at 80 miles an hour. And the coach will there will say, well, you've got a 4 for that, a 6 for that, or you were out there and you'd lose some runs. And it's a competition. And so what we were interested in, again, was this was an actual task. They would come in and we'd say, actually, you're going to be compared against other individuals. These are other people in the same squad as you. The coaches are very interested in using this as a selection tool, as an indication of how you're able to perform under pressure. And again, we see those individuals who are challenged, that is, when they are told about the upcoming competition, display this increase in cardiac output, decrease in vascular resistance, perform better. And a lot of that research I've done with Martin Turner, who's a colleague at the university. That's the data demonstrating there's a relationship between our cardiovascular responses to stress and performance. And so another interesting question is, can we change our cardiovascular responses to a stressor? So remember the 3 things that we're interested in, which is self-efficacy, which is control, and which is an approach focus. And there was a lot of body research that's demonstrated that actually we can get people to have a challenge response to stress or a threat response to stress. But the way they did the challenge response was simply to say to them, just do your best, it doesn't matter. And particularly myself and colleagues involved in elite sport, it's very difficult to say to athletes, it doesn't matter, or just do your best, because it does matter. And so what we were interested in was seeing if we can use those resource appraisals and change the cardiovascular responses to stress, even in something that's going to be quite stressful to those individuals. So again, we sanitize this. It's a little bit removed from the real world because we're doing this in a laboratory setting. But what we did is we got around 40 participants and we brought them into the laboratory. And these were students in the university. We said, look, we want you to come into this laboratory. We're going to ask you to do a task. It's going to be an athletic task, so please wear athletic clothing. And they would come in one by one. And then we would do the usual, set them down, hook them up to the equipment, collect our baseline data, and then we say, you're now going to watch a video of the task you're about to do. And so half of you, if you can imagine, would see this first video, and the other half on this lecture theatre would see a second video. Now, this half of the lecture theatre, imagine that you're watching
Your task is to climb a 10-metre climbing wall located in the sports hall. You will be given 5 minutes to complete this task. You will complete this task alone. You will be given climbing instructions before you start the task and will be provided with all equipment including a safety harness and rope. Your climb will be video recorded and later viewed so your climbing ability and performance can be assessed. Try your best not to fall off the wall at any point. It is unlikely that you will have done a task exactly like this before, so you obviously can't be sure that you will climb the wall effectively. Because of this inexperience, how well you do on the task may be related to factors outside of your control, such as luck in choosing the right holds. The experimenter will accompany you to the sports hall where the climbing task will take place. You will begin climbing when the experimenter asks you to begin, and the task will end when you choose to stop climbing or run out of time. You can, of course, withdraw from the task at any time, but for the moment, please remain seated and remain as still as possible for about 2 minutes while you think about the climbing task, prepare yourself to climb, and we collect some cardiovascular data.
Okay, good. So that's the video that this side saw, and it's 10 meters is nice, I think, because it's the height at which if you fall off, you can kill yourself. So it's quite a sort of a stressful situation, particularly if you've never climbed before. So these people had never climbed before. This half, you got to see this video.
Your task is to climb a 10-meter climbing wall located in the sports hall. You will be given 5 minutes to complete this task. You will complete this task alone. You will be given climbing instructions before you start the task and will be provided with all equipment including a safety harness and rope. Your climb will be video recorded and later viewed so your climbing ability and performance can be assessed. Try your best to stay on the wall and get as high as you can within the 5-minute time period. Although you may not have done a task exactly like this before, you will have seen or perhaps performed similar climbing tasks in the past. So you can feel confident that you will be able to climb effectively. Because of this experience, you will have control over the skills required to climb well. The experimenter will accompany you to the sports hall where the climbing task will take place. You will begin climbing when the experimenter asks you to begin, and the task will end when you choose to stop climbing or run out of time. You can, of course, withdraw from the task at any time, but for the moment, please remain seated and remain as still as possible for about 2 minutes while you think about the climbing task, prepare yourself to climb, and we collect some cardiovascular data.
Now, climbing a 10-meter climbing wall is stressful if you've never climbed it before, but you could probably all guess once you see them side by side, which do you think, was it the first video or the second video that induced the challenge state? Second one, yeah. So, again, the participants in both groups display a stress response. Now, all we do is change 3 sentences in what's about a 90-second video. And what we see in the challenge group is a decrease in vascular resistance, increase in cardiac output, and the opposite in the threat group. So we're changing the physiological response, the cardiovascular response is dependent on on just the sentences that we give. And the implication of that is in terms of how leaders and how coaches and some of the things they might say to individuals beforehand. Of course, we're taking a laboratory setting, it's sanitized, it's clinical in that sense. But we can all think of situations in our practice or when we've worked with athletes where the emphasis has been on don't mess this up. We've also done some work on individual levels. This is in the university, so this is a student experiencing exam stress, so we can show these changes at individual levels. Lots of students get stressed about examinations. So presented, and this is how they responded when they thought about an examination at baseline. So increase in TPR, little or no change in cardiac output. 2 weeks of an individualized developed imagery script to focus on self-efficacy, control, and an approach focus to the examinations and the revision. And then when they came back in and they thought about the examination and they were preparing themselves for that, we see the challenge response, decrease in vascular resistance, increase in cardiac output. So that's some of the research that we're doing. And of course, I think Kate and Steve are quite right. So I'm part of a group and I do some consultancy myself, and I used to work at Stoke City Academy. But Joe Dixon, who was in the audience, is now the club psychologist for Stoke City, has a role in the first team as well as the academy. And so Joe's doing applying a lot of this work with the academy. So we're trying to work with individual players on their mindset, and we use the pressure testing protocol on match days, so we collect the cardiovascular data. We have that information as a way of starting a discussion with the players. And of course, that is a snapshot in time about how they might be feeling about an upcoming competition. And that gives us a way of discussing about the players' responses or approaches to competition, and a way of entering into a bit of discussion with them, and also a way of collecting data to monitor some of our interventions. And Joe's doing some more general stuff in terms of some of the education sessions, and as well as changing the culture a little bit in terms of player ownership in developing their own development plans. So increasing the feelings of control. So certainly when I worked in professional football at an academy level, if there was one sort of psychological variable that you thought you could do with working on with the players, it was their perceived control. Everything was out of their control. They couldn't control anything. The opposition always had more advantages than them, and so on. So I think we developed a protocol for assessing athlete responses to psychological stress. There's a consistent relationship between the cardiovascular reactivity and performance, and in a laboratory, in a group setting, we show how we can change it across two groups. Also, we can show how we can change it at an individual level. We've collected quite a lot of data from elite athletes, including those in the squad leading up to Rio, as well as some of the more elite players at Stoke City. And actually, we find some challenges in collecting this type of data with elite athletes. This type of data relies on a stress response. It relies on the heart rate increasing, and then we look at the changes in cardiac output and TPR. What we found with some elite samples is that about 40% of those samples actually show, when they get them to think about something that's important, stressful, upcoming competition, you see the heart rate go down. And so it doesn't kind of work for this particular methodology. We're going to go back through all of the data we've collected over the last 5 years to try to understand what it is about those individuals that display either a suppression or relaxation response when they think about competition. I just want to finish off. I've got just a couple of minutes left, and just talk a little bit about where we think some of this work is going and how Joe is applying that at Stoke City. Of course, we talk on an individual basis about an individual psychological approach, about them, about how they can think about things differently, about how the things I can say to someone might influence how they respond. But also the broader culture is an area of interest. And we know, if you think from a public health perspective, social isolation is going to be one of the big public health issues. And we know that is associated with lower life expectancy, and not just from, a social isolation in old age, and if you fall, there's nobody there to help you, and so on. It's from a range of other factors. We know social isolation is associated with increased cortisol, lower self-regulation, increased threat perception on one side, and then the sense of belonging is associated with more positive attributes, our collective self. And belonging and identifying with a group can be an effective way of inoculating against some negative stress responses. And some of the work that we did with the coaches at Stoke City, we found that social support for the coaches was not surprisingly, a very important way of helping them deal with stress, both in their previous playing career and now. So I think in some, I guess our potential for achieving sort of high performance behaviours is not ideal if we don't identify with the group. And recently I've had the opportunity to meet, myself and Joe have been down to meet Owen Eastwood, and Owen is a team culture expert, and he's worked with the military high command at NATO, worked over the last 4 years with the South African cricket team, and worked with, currently working with the Scotland rugby team. And it's been a great opportunity to meet with someone like Owen, who's worked at that elite level and looked at culture, and start to understand a little bit about culture and how he goes about developing a team culture. This is his model. And underpinning the building blocks of his model are identity, what makes us different, what makes us special, and what impact we want to have in our world. And then that impacts up to standards, the way we do things, trust, and shared ownership. I quite liked Owen's model. He comes from a Maori background, has that quite sort of connection to the past. And I've done lots of team sessions where I've tried to develop team culture. They've often been sessions about the here and now, about this team at this particular moment, about what makes this particular group now special at this moment in time. And I quite like Owen's approach because he makes a clear point about rooting that in the identity of that team and the history of that team. And we're doing some work now in other large organisations or sporting organisations, but looking at the history and where that particular organisation has come from as a way of feeding into the identity. Of course, the people in the here and now are important, but that connection with the past, that sense of belonging that we search for, we see it in sports fans, see it in ourselves in the way it's important for us to identify with and to be part of a group and to understand what that group is about and what it means. And sometimes when some of the sessions, if I'm being honest, I've done have been very much about the here and now, and it doesn't have that anchor that sometimes being able to identify with the historical basis of where that group has come from and the history of a particular organisation. And so he emphasises that, amongst many other things. And that's an area that we're exploring now, and Joe is taking this on in terms of the work that he's doing at the academy setting. So the first point I should have put actually in the other one. What's the best way to teach people how to deal with situational anxiety, develop a challenge mindset? It's to put them in those situations where they get to achieve success. So Joe will work with the coaches and start to think about ways that they can put players under pressure. And we've had lots of discussions, and they'll be about some of the training regimes, about the competitive nature of some of the training situations. But also we've had discussions as well about even simple things at an academy level, like saying the driver's not going to pick you up this morning. You've got to find your way to the training ground. So things like that test people and put them in situations that they've never been before are quite nice ways of developing that challenge culture. But Joe's going through the process with the coaches now in terms of the clarification of identity and purpose. You think about the physical environment and develop that in accordance with it. And then you draw in the wider group as well. Once you identify what the identity is, you draw in that wider group of parents and so on. Got a feeling I might have run over. So in a year when England win the Grand Slam, I always want to put a quote by a Welshman up there. Sorry, Nigel, just for the... but I think, it actually fitted in with a lot of things that Nigel was saying saying last night, rather, actually, in terms of you think about cultures and, we need to give people the opportunity to make mistakes and give them... and support them in that regard. But I think in terms of our challenge mindset, you try to think of how you can capture some of the work that we're doing. But I suppose the things I would say is that we know that there are particular patterns of physiological responses that are associated with good and bad performance. We also know as well that we think we can change those, and that's at a group level. We can do that work at an individual level as well. But I will say that some of the group data I presented hides a lot of variation, lots of individual variation in there as well. But we can change that and we can have an influence in it. And thinking about how that fits in with the broader culture, the broader community, and the broader team setting, I think is something, somewhere where we're looking to take that next. So thank you.